Welcome, everyone. So this is the working title. I mean, the other title I had was Wish It, Want It Webhooks, but we went with this one. So there's a couple of things we're going to kind of talk about today. The intent of this kind of talk is not just to talk about what I found, but also the process that I went through to discover this. And if you're interested, I know a lot of people kind of seeing talks and stuff, they want to get involved, they want to start contributing. So I want to kind of address and kind of give you some guidance around that and kind of share how I approached it. But of course, we're going to be talking about a lot of these deficiencies or goodies as I found. But we can't kind of begin there without first talking about the previous research that Bo DaftHack did with GraphRunner. So GraphRunner, big, huge framework that was released, I think, last October at Wild West Hacking Fest. Really focuses on PostX using the Microsoft Graph API. If you're unfamiliar with that, just picture the entire suite of Microsoft services, applications, all being interconnected. Anything from Outlook to even like the command line interface for Azure. What's really interesting is the ability to interact with it. And all you need are these tokens. There's two really ones we're going to talk a lot about. They're called access tokens. These are tokens that kind of give you the types of privileges. If you kind of think about it from a traditional Active Directory concept, it's the rights that you are given, as well as your ability to refresh. This is kind of like a typical cookie where as it refreshes or stales out, determines the length of your access. Definitely worthwhile checking out, especially as we take a look at the current landscape. Attackers are not so much always constantly looking at deploying C2, bypassing EDR, and then establishing a trench event. With the introduction of cloud and all these cloud-connected apps, everything has to move into the cloud. So does our kind of focus. And GraphRunner really kind of does that by focusing in on all those services and being able to exploit and determine vulnerabilities and attack paths. Now, what I want to say is with the Graph API, it's a great feature and everything else, but with everything, there are some limitations. These limitations kind of connect to the fact that while there might be everything you can imagine from all the different Microsoft services, the access they have is not 100% into all the different features. So since we're talking about Teams, doesn't have all the access to Microsoft Teams backend options. Same thing with Office. So, and that was partly by design by Microsoft, I'm led to believe. But without worrying about that, that's kind of how we started down this path. But what we're really going to be focusing on with this path are these. These are called Microsoft connectors. So if you've ever looked at your Microsoft Teams, I'm sure everyone has used Teams at one point, and you'll notice that there are things like, hey, SharePoint's connected in there. I can just access different files. There's a Notepad app or file sharing. Those are all services or backend features that allow your Teams chat program, instant messaging, video calling, to connect to other services in your organization. And that's a really great feature for interconnectivity. And Microsoft is kind of taking this to the next step by focusing in on other things, such as development, or even the ability to connect to third-party tools, such as Jira, Azure, GitHub, and it allows them to share communication, sends commands, or automate features. So in this day and age, there's a lot of great interconnectivity, especially when we look at this. If you have any type of ticketing type of system, rather than constantly refreshing the browser whenever a new ticket is generated, for instance, it can notify you in your organization, hey, one of your clients has a ticket, here's the title, here's the link to it, and it just instantly gets pushed. These connector apps have a backend functionality that are basically called webhooks. These webhooks are as easy to kind of set up as 1, 2, 3, click, 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 and bam, you have this URL. And it's really easy, simplified, made to be used by any user. And that's kind of one of the big first things we're going to talk about is the fact is that any user can kind of access and create these. Now, I've kind of talked and said that word a lot, webhooks. So let's actually ask, what are webhooks and why do we care? So webhooks are essentially a callback mechanism over the web, HTTP protocols, that can be triggered on specific events. I mentioned one just now about if a ticket is created, but it can be even something more devices I've seen in client organizations that maybe don't have a traditional reception desk where someone's there to greet, that whenever someone kind of enters through the foyer, the entire organization is notified that there's a guest at the waiting room, so to speak. To even development companies who are constantly pushing code out, like big companies like you see NVIDIA, Microsoft, even where they're pushing new code, a build process, say, hey, your build has been completed. How these webhooks work is that when a request is sent, it's essentially a post request, and it is configured in such a way that with what's called a data or payload, that information is then translated into either a response or an action. But these post requests can be sent from anyone. It's really focusing on not so much an individual like myself and an admin, but versus two different services sending data between the two of them. So why do we care? Well, the fact that these are externally exposed and that the data can be sent and translated into a message opens up the opportunity for phishing. If we can find a way that doesn't allow us to have to go through all those email filters like traditional phishing does, why not take that route? So when we look at it, and as I mentioned before with attackers, as the landscapes mature and new technologies kind of create layers and it's harder to create, a successful phish that doesn't get instantly burnt or filtered out, looking for alternative ways to still do the same sort of focus is a big kind of, I would say, interest in this industry. We see that a lot. So having these connectors apps send a message for you does multiple different things. It draws less scrutiny. A lot of users are more trusting of an application like, hey, corporate notifications sent out, please scan this QR code to update your MDM policy. More users are likely to trust things that are inside the network because that's kind of how a lot of the focus has been trained on, is that trust things internally, but anything external, distrust. We put warning flags on any external message and stuff. So having an ability to interact with things and they land inside the network, messaging apps, is a huge win. And as I mentioned before, any user can create these. We're talking low privilege users. You don't need to have special privileges. You just have to be someone inside the network or organization. And what's also, as I started down this path looking, Microsoft has an approved list of over 100 apps, ranging from anything you can imagine, like even Trello or any of those types of services you can imagine. They have it. Notion, you name it. All of those are designed to be connected into your teams for ease of use. And because of that, we can kind of take advantage of it. Now, I mentioned before, and you're probably saying, well, it can't be right. They're externally focused. Anyone can send anything. There's got to be some sort of authentication. You're right. On webhooks themselves, there are supported authentication methods. Basic APIs, secret key, BearerToken, cookie authentication, MLTS, you name it. But this is where it gets kind of, I'll say, comical, but also interesting. Because Microsoft strips them out, doesn't have any requirements. So all those applications, whenever you create a connector with a webhook, they have no authentication. It's almost as if they strip it out. What does this mean? That anyone unauthenticated, and that is external, can send a message to that webhook URL, that HTTP URL, and that message can be translated into something that then is sent as a message to the entire channel. So if it's a big channel, let's say organization has maybe a general chat for the entire organization of 300, that one message can be sent to every single person. Now that opens up a huge opportunity for phishing or even some types of attacks. We have, and if you read or looked at the article, we've discussed this with Microsoft and stuff. And their kind of view is that this is not a security issue, for the reasons that in order to find one or create one, you already have to have access. So if an attacker already had that ability, they probably got in through a different way. I would say probably almost everyone would also believe that this probably is an issue, and the fact that you just need to have some kind of access. We still see that day in, day out, where users are clicking on links, people's passwords are getting compromised, people are getting access. So this is now just a way to kind of deploy a persistence or even move from one account to another. But now let's kind of dive into the more technical things about how do we actually find these. So I mentioned before, once again, huge shout out to Bo for all the hard work he did on GraphRunner. Truly an amazing tool for doing any type of graph or API based attacks. So kind of right here, just you start up by requesting a graph token. This is done through device login. So if you're not familiar, when you log in through device, Microsoft.com/device login, you get a code. When you enter that code in, you already have an active session. It says, hey, do you want to create a device token for this session? When you click yes, whatever's requesting, in this case, GraphRunner, then is able to generate an access and refresh token. So once we have that starting point, we can take that refresh, because it's focused mainly on graph, and we can request it to move from one application to another. In this case, it's space.skype. That's what Microsoft calls Teams now. If you're familiar, remember back in the day, they bought Skype, and it looks like they just left all the naming conventions the same. But once we do that, we actually then gain the ability to query things inside of Microsoft Teams, specifically those connectors and their configurations. So as I mentioned, we couldn't just use our standard access and refresh token because those are assigned to graph. But luckily, Microsoft has done all the hard work for us. They have provided an actual API that we can query using our access tokens, and we can define the client as Skype Spaces. And what they do is they do all the work for us. They generate all the proper privileges. They generate all the new access tokens we need for Teams. They automate the work for us. And these are the tokens that we need. And what you'll kind of see is if you see that third one right here, request verification token, that number on the bottom, the reason why I left it there is that number you'd think would be unique per session or user and tenant. That's the same across all the tenants we've tested, and that's about 7. That's just the name of the token that someone left in there. So it's quite interesting to see that. So this is what it would look like if we were kind of intercepting the traffic. We pass our tokens to this API, and we receive new authentication credentials and tokens. And if we actually decode those tokens that we just get, we kind of see some of those keywords that we were mentioning before: connectors, apps, authorization, read, write. So this gives us all that access to start looking at those types of connectors and any of that information, like who generated it, their name, their purpose. And of course, what we really do care about is that webhook URL. But what we first need before we can even get down there is that connector configuration ID. This ID is an actual unique base64 encoded string that distinguishes one connector app from another, because you can have multiple connector apps in the same channel, and they can have multiple of the same type. So this is how Microsoft Teams distinguishes 2 connector apps. Anyone's question, the connector app base64 string is not the name of the connector app. It is a randomly generated value. So there's no way to kind of enumerate those. But once we have that value, we can actually then query to see the backend. So when we actually pass all these things with all the proper values, the proper URL, we actually start to see some of the weirdness that kind of is the magic of Teams or how it was developed. Specifically, you'd think with the standard authentication, we would get the access and we then move on. That's not the case. What we actually get is an error message. And this is the example. So if we're looking at this burp output get response, we can see that we have kind of structured everything with the proper cookies and stuff. We're trying to request a specific backend to a specific channel, and we get an error. And that's not supposed to be the way. Because if we actually look at this through a web browser and try to navigate there normally when we go through like the GUI functions, we can see the exact same structure works. Same fields, everything else, they work. We can see that connector ID, everything works. But, and once again, I want to stress this, this is where it starts to get a little weird. If we look at the SkypeSpaceToken, that value is not the one we were originally generated. So when I was going through this, I noticed this and was like, this is odd. This is really odd. This doesn't make sense. How come when I almost copy it programmatically, it fails, but just looking at it normally, everything works? And it took me a while in talking with Bo to realize that the size, when we were looking at it, of that SkypeSpaceToken is very different than the previous one. So we took this value that was working, copied it, and searched for its first occurrence. And what we discovered was there's actually another thing that happens in the background. We see that this Teams Microsoft API auth service, authorized with a Z, very important, creates this Skype token. And this Skype token, while it has a different name than SkypeSpaceToken, actually has that value that was used and worked. So that means that another token is being created with a very similar name. And yes, it does get very confusing. Trust me, I have made this mistake, and I probably will make this mistake many times throughout this presentation. But there is a difference between SkypeSpaceToken and Skype token. Now, if we take this Skype token and we decode it like I did before, we see there's nothing in there that shows authentication, authorization, connector, or anything. It just kind of shows a few little things related to the app, the tenant, but it works. So if we take this value, we know where it is, we can request it. We take this value and we place it into our code that wasn't working, and it works. All we have to do is what, for lack of better terms, some quick cookie editing, which shouldn't be the case, but it is. As you can kind of see right here, this is the code that's been updated in GraphRunner. But walking through it, we go through, we do that request. We set up all the proper headers to that authorized Z URL. Once we get that value, we actually look for that Skype token. We pull it out. And then, and this shouldn't work, we take our current set of cookies, we find that SkypeSpaceToken, we remove the value, we put in this one. We make a temporary set of cookies that we then use for that. We still have our old good ones with that SkypeSpace original value, but now we have another set of cookies that have that Skype token value in there. And why I kind of mention that is that this shouldn't be a thing. Realistically, I shouldn't be able to just quickly cut and paste two different values in there and it work. There should be some sort of validation around these cookies and stuff, because this could be potentially lead to other boundaries of access or escalation of privileges, or who knows. But it's a feature and it's working as intended. So when we do that, as we go through it, we now have the ability to grab the connector information. So you can kind of see who created it. There's a description, but there's that connector ID. So now we have that connector ID. And so now we can go and actually start enumerating. So once we have that ID, we have the right tokens, we pass it again to this management console, and all of a sudden we get a response. We get a response that is a large blob of data, but if you actually look through it, there is actually a field that's copy on click webhook, copy to clipboard, and that's your entire webhook. The webhook structure is actually, it's really funny, it's almost universal across all different tenants. It's the domain name, .webhook.office.com/webhook2, and then it's a series of strings that contain the tenant ID, a unique identifier, the channel ID, team ID. But it really does kind of show like I was able to edit a cookie to gain access to something that previously I couldn't. That shouldn't be a thing, but it is. So I did want to risk the demo god, so I took screenshots today. So here's a great type of example of how that Get-Webhooks module in GraphRunner works. Going through all those steps, what it does is it looks for every single channel that you have access to and every single team. It will then go through all those steps and pull down this connector information and that webhook address. So now you know what these webhooks are, what they're used for, and that address. Now, what happens if there isn't one? Well, don't worry, because we have the same ability to create them. How do you start? Well, it's actually the same process we just went through with an extra step. Rather than just posting a GET request and getting that content, what we actually do is we take it one step further and we send a post request. Now, this post request has what's called a WebKit form. And here's a sample of what that kind of looks like. So you have like the WebKit boundaries. That string at the end is just an identifier for this request. They're random each time. You can actually make them up. But inside that is basically a series of data points of what needs to happen. So sometimes in this case with Microsoft, you actually have to have a request verification token. We'll talk about that in a second. But the connector's name, is there an alternate name? That basics for string identifier. Who owns it? Is there an email associated with it? All those types of pieces are kind of put into this request that you then post. And if every single piece is kind of there, like if you think about like one of those forms you're filling in, say you're signing up or you're filling in for a questionnaire, and it's like this question's optional, this one's required. That's basically what this WebKit form is. It's a series of things that need to be passed in order for Microsoft Teams to be like, yep, I have enough information. I will create this webhook. There is a catch. And once again, things that, I spent far too much time, late nights, pulling my hair out, trying to figure out. Because once again, there was no guide for any of this stuff. We kind of started looking at this blindly, and there was a lot of nights trying to just me figuring out what's going on and try to understand how this was all put together. But when you do pass these values, we get an error. And what's really funny is that you'd think, didn't it just work for a get to get all the information? Why would it fail? You'd think that it would be in the WebKit. No, no, no. Microsoft Teams requires an additional edit in your request when you are passing or requesting to create a webhook. And that is that you need to specify in the URL the general channel of the Teams ID that you are trying to create a channel to. I know that sounds really confusing, but every channel in every single Microsoft Teams has a general channel. It's the first one that's created. That is what they call the root or primary identifier. So if you think about SQL database or anything else, there's always that primary key. Think of this general channel as that primary key. So you need to pass that along so that way the WebKit can be properly interpreted. And it looks like from going through, I wouldn't say hundreds of requests, this works because when it's created, the request is actually passed and says, okay, here's your team, okay? But before we can make anything, we need to make sure that this is a valid team. And they do this by saying, what's the general channel ID? If there are not two values that match, it fails. So I want to show an example of what that looks like. So in the first picture, you see there's a post request. And what I've highlighted in the first set of red boxes is that channel ID. It is a long string ending with thread tag v2. You can see it's identical to what's in the cookie value, because that was my assumption going into this, that I just had to specify the channel I wanted to create it in, and it fails. But once again, looking through Burp and looking through the traffic of a legitimate web, proxy of a web session, you can see that it's actually not the case. And when you are looking at all these long strings and everything else, they kind of blend together. So it did take me a while before I realized, wait a second, those two values are different. And once I figured that out, it was quite easy to figure out what this ID was, which was the general, and all of a sudden everything just clicked and started working. And you can kind of see in the second picture of the response, all of a sudden we got, that same sort of thing. Here's the success plus here's the copy button if you want to copy the webhook into your clipboard. So what does it look like? So when you generate it, you get a series of token values. And I mentioned before that request value. You can kind of see this right now in this demo picture. That just says, hey, you're requesting the right to create a channel. So that value just says, hey, the user, they have access. It's just an additional step. It's Microsoft's way of, checking through authorization. But once you kind of create it, this bottom picture is kind of what it looks like. So you see the name here, you can see who kind of set it up. But now you have this webhook, you have this app connected in. And from then on, you can send messages, you name it, and they show up. You can even embed pictures in there. So some of the types of things we've tried to do is, QR code phishing through these Teams channels with this method. So when we tested this in the wild, as I mentioned before, Microsoft claims that this does not meet the requirements for a security issue, mainly because in order to do any of this, you already need to have some kind of access. So this is really kind of not focused in as an initial access tool, but as a great way to perform persistence. Why? Well, it's really hard to detect webhooks. Default tenants come with hundreds of them allowed by default. They're whitelisted and kind of, I would not want to say the word signed because that kind of gives a different notification, but what they're called is Microsoft AOK'd. By deleting or even disabling the user that created the webhook, say, for instance, a user that gets compromised through standard IR procedures might get isolated. That doesn't affect the webhook at all. In fact, when you disable a user, you lose any traces of all their messages, which makes it nearly impossible for IR to find out where this webhook is created. So you would have to go through every single channel they've had access to and look to see. And in testing we've done through clients, even in our test environments, pretty much everyone's susceptible to this. There are some ways you can disable some of these types of apps, but it's pretty much if you allow apps, you're susceptible to this. And kind of taking this a step further, what's really interesting is, as I mentioned, that process, it was very important, is because when we do this, we never actually install the connector app itself. So if you remember those pictures I showed at the beginning, you first add it, then you can kind of create it. By going through those series of get and post requests, we actually generate a webhook that never installs the app itself. So if we kind of see right here, here's a general channel. We've just created it. Low privilege user has set up cloud, Jira Cloud. But when we actually look in that channel, we still haven't had it installed. You can see incoming webhooks has been installed. So now we can configure a webhook, but not Jira Cloud. So the other thing I discovered, which I classify this, and I dub this as this goes into things that should never be a thing in an environment, is the ability that channels can actually have an email address. There's an actual GUI button, yes, that says get email address, and it actually creates an email address for that channel. As you can kind of see, I do want to pause and acknowledge there are options. You can have it set to only Teams members, which means only people that are part of this team can send it emails. Or you can go more granular and say, I only want emails sent from these domains to be allowed. And then my personal favorite, and I'm sure it's everyone's, anyone. That means open-ended access. These channels can be, these email addresses are generated with a random string. So they're very hard to kind of guess or kind of predict. So there's no way to kind of enumerate them blindly. And as I kind of mentioned, those are the 3 types of options. And what's really important here that we want to focus in on as an attacker is the anyone, because this means that any external unauthenticated user can send a message to this email address and it gets translated into a message into Teams. So once again, we reported this to Microsoft. Their response was that, this has to be enabled by IT. We observed that this is enabled by default across every single type of tenant you can imagine. Dev tenants, our private research ones, freshly created ones as of last month even, and even clients. So it's there. The only time that we've seen where it's not is if it's part of a government 365 plan. And honestly, it's so simple to set up. You just need to do get, post, and even a put request. And I'm going to show you how that kind of looks. It's very easy. All you need is a bearer token. So when you pass the channel to this API, what it's actually going to do is look and say, hey, is there an email assigned? It says, yes, there is. Here's the email ID. And here's the settings. So it's set to members. So that means only members of that channel can send it an email, and it will process it. If there isn't one, you get a response of not found. That's what the get response allows us to do, is to kind of figure out if there is or isn't one. A post request to the same URL allows us to set a channel. So if one's not already there, just by attending, if you look right down at the bottom, these 2 values, the sender type and the domains. Once you pass that, it then creates an email address with those permissions. So obviously we want to set it to anyone. So we can. And then the last one, put. Put is used for when there is already an existing channel, but it has, say, a different set of memberships. Say, for instance, it says only allow these domains or allow teams only, member only, sorry. By sending a put request, you can actually update the value to whatever you want. Now, when I say this can all be done by a low privilege user. It doesn't have to be an admin. It's anyone that has access to that channel can do this. And you can kind of see right here. So we've changed it. And then if we send it another GET request, all of a sudden it's been set to anyone. So now that we have it, let's use it. So this is kind of where I tip my hat to Reverse Shell. He's been doing a lot of great work with phishing and spamming. He has released a ton of articles on Black Hills' blog about sending messages. If you haven't checked it out, I definitely, on top of all this, I cannot say more. There's a lot of great content here. But if I was to abstract what his approach would be, obviously first set up a tenant with Office 365. He's even set up a repo to find great domains to use to phish. And then you can even use Microsoft's Azure client and SendMail to just send a message using that address. And this is what it looks like when it shows up. So it's not the most elegant and clean, but what's really important here is that it just sent a message into a channel. And you can see that there's an attachment, the original message, and everything else. So this is a great way to kind of find another way around all those nasty email filters and still target users. I know there's a lot of content here and stuff. We can spend hours talking about it, but I do want to stop and talk about defensive. I know I just kind of showed you 2 massive, flaws and loopholes to get around. And I think it's important to talk about the defensive measures, since I've mentioned that right now there isn't really a fix yet by Microsoft. And the hope of publishing all this information is to kind of create some awareness and get the dialogue going. And hopefully someone can build upon these defensive perspectives. But at the very least, if you don't need any of these connector apps, disable all of them. I mean, it's an arduous task, but as you've seen, once one is deployed, it's next to impossible to find and stop. So if you're an IT admin, start looking to see and start disabling them all. With regards to a channel email address, this is kind of where it gets a little weird. Microsoft does have a fix, and we're going to talk about it in a second. The reason why we're going to talk about it in a second is it doesn't really work. But what we've tested and kind of seen with some success is that if you can enforce a policy in your Azure tenant that says any channel can only send once a domain is created, it instantly updates to certain domains that you as an organization own. That prevents us from ever being able to create a channel and keep it set to anyone. So that's an important thing right there. Now to talk about their fix. In conversation, they believe that why this is not an issue is because they have this option built in, that you can just turn it off, and this is not a problem. What we tried to illustrate was that this feature only turns it off in the GUI. So if you see that button, get email address is no longer there. Problem is, it doesn't actually disable the API. So if we use GraphRunner again, we can still interact with that URL and API to do the exact same things. So that's why looking at if you can enforce a way to ensure that anytime a channel address is created through Azure or conditional access policies, that it's set to say, your own company, that will prevent an attacker from being able to then send it from any domain. And that's what we've seen as the most effective right now for it. As I mentioned, I pose these as a way to kind of stop it, or a way to slow it down. But more information, more development in the defensive perspective is definitely needed. And as I mentioned at the beginning, continuing the research. If you're interested in this, or you're just curious, like, hey, I know you've talked a lot about certain things. I'd love to get more into it. I'd love to look into it. That's kind of the whole point of this talk, is I want to kind of share what I've done, my approach in a brief setting. I know it's an hour's tight time frame, but hoping to give a roadmap. Mainly because Teams is a staple. Every organization I've ever worked with has used it. The fact that we rely on it as a massive communication point, or even for sharing information, having these massive insecurities in there are kind of easy windfalls for attackers and huge pitfalls for defenders. So my kind of focus here with sharing this is, shed some light, open this discussion. We've tried to reach out to Microsoft, but only was kind of given this is working as intended. And personally, I believe this is not. So this needs to be addressed. And obviously continuing the roadmap, as Bo and I were alluding to at the beginning in the pre-show banter, there's a lot of things that have yet to be discovered, both in the Graph, Cloud, API, or even in Teams, Office, SharePoint, you name it. There's just so much as things are moving into an apps or connections stuff. The need to kind of battle harden, test, and lock up, shore up any type of shortcomings or deficiencies is really a must and doesn't often get enough focus. So how did I kind of do this? I mean, as I kind of mentioned a lot of the approach, what I just needed a Windows VM, some type of web traffic interceptor. I use Burp, but Zap or any of the other ones are great. You just need something that can basically intercept the traffic so you can look at it, or even resend it as you're testing. And then you can spin up for low price, or even get a dev environment of the Office 365. You just have to make sure it has Teams access if you're focusing on Teams. If you're kind of looking at it and going, maybe, SharePoint, I want to look at SharePoint, just make sure it has that access and that you would see in a standard organization. And you're really just looking at how it looks in the browser. Every time you kind of open it up, make sure you're intercepting, log in, click on a button, send a message, open a file or something like that. See how it looks in the web browser, because that's really where it is. A lot of things you don't see, but looking at the browser, you can kind of start seeing values. And then it just comes to just manipulating and playing around with it to see what it can do. Oftentimes you'll see, like, a lot of times it'll be like failure, 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 success, success. Why did that work? And that's how that kind of ball starts snowballing down the hill into a giant, epic discovery. So if you're interested more, highly recommend GraphRunner. If you want to kind of, I know this has been a 1 hour talk, but if you're interested in reading the entire article, it is long and in depth. It's right here. I highly recommend it. But thank you for everyone's time.
Hello. Hey, Matt, can you hear me?
Yep, sorry. I think because there was not sound for a while, my headphones went into power mode.
Oh, no. Well done. Bo, if you are still available and you want to jump back in, feel free to do so.
Yeah, I'm not allowed to start my video currently. So
Oh, you
I think
can't?
Ryan stole my privileges.
I mean, it's an epic photo of you.
Sounds right.
That is true. That is an epic photo of you. So
there
Matt,
it is.
Matt, we'll get to the questions here, but to the audience, how are you all doing with this information? I think there was a lot of like head slaps and a lot of
I think you crushed a lot of souls, Matt.
Uh-oh.
It was pretty awesome watching chat.
You didn't. Microsoft did. You didn't.
Right.
I may have just shined a giant light on it.
Here's the question. Does the webhook vulnerability apply to private channels? Can an external sender post messages in private channels?
So a private channel, I believe, has the ability to still create connector apps unless it's disabled by your admin. The moment you kind of go into those connectors, if you see the option for connectors, you are vulnerable. And an external user can send it in there if they get that URL. The URL string, as I kind of showed, was very long, so it takes a long time if you're trying to brute force guess the string. That's why if you have the ability to phish a user and get some kind of access, enumerating them is the easiest way to do it. I think I calculated it would take almost a month based on the character space to brute force guess a webhook URL.
Okay, so just a month.
Yeah,
it's not bad.
Actually, so Matt, like while you're talking, I thought of something. I was wondering if you had tested it. So have you tried creating a webhook, or do you know if it's possible to create a webhook as a guest user in a tenant?
I don't think it's possible, mainly because guest users don't have the same permissions to add and create. So that was something that I didn't look into, because typically a guest has no privileges. They just have the ability to chat. And usually whoever's inviting them into the channel has to grant them more permission. So, I mean, it'd be an interesting experiment. I would love to see me proven wrong. I mean, that would be another great
we're gonna have to test that. We're gonna have to test that. That sounds
like something we're gonna do.
All right. So a lot of questions. I think the big thing was, how do I mitigate this? And glad you talked about that. But like, if anyone wants to get involved with like helping to mitigate this, what are some ways that they can help? And I think you touched on it, but like just really dive into like, what are some ways that people can help mitigate this as an issue?
So stop, don't mitigate it. Like
it's fine. I mean, Microsoft says it's not an issue, so why do we worry? No. I always say this with a lot of the research I've been doing, security research, especially into EDRs, low-level Windows APIs, and bugs in Windows for years. The way I look at it is I like to break things. So I try to give my best viewpoint on how to fix things, but I always like to leave an open-ended discussion. Here is how I found it. Here are all the impacts and stuff. Because there are amazing defensive mind, or people who are focused, with a defensive focus in mind. I know I said defensive 7 times in that statement, but that probably can take my information, kind of do a better job solving it. So honestly, take a look at the research, play around with it, recreate it in your environment. If you are a blue teamer, if you're someone that does some SOC work or defensive work, or even if you're someone that does programming and you know how to do secure coding, recreate it, look at it, start a dialogue. I always say, for lack of better terms, you can always reach out to me if you have a question, but getting the information out there on how I was able to recreate this and not kind of hiding it behind some kind of cloak and doors or paywall, so that way it's free and enable is it just looking at it. Honestly, I know that was me rambling, but
yeah. And Matt, just to be clear, like, how long have we waited to talk about this?
So I mean, are you saying since we discovered it, or since we finished the whole disclosure process with Microsoft?
All of it, right?
Oh, so we discovered this back in, I want to say, October, and we disclosed this once we had everything. It was hard, especially with Q4 around Christmas time. Obviously, everything was shut down, so we didn't hear any response. But we've been working with Microsoft for probably a couple of months, back and forth, sharing information about it until the tickets were kind of closed. So October, about 6 months, well, since we initially found it.
Yeah. And yeah, every once in a while we'll get an email from someone that works at that company. So what are you expecting anything now, or are they just gonna like?
My experience has always been, especially with things like with Windows, they'll just silently patch it, and then all of a sudden it'll stop working or something like that. If there's a big enough draw, there usually is one voice doesn't create enough of a wave to change things, especially with how big of a fix it would be, as I kind of showed, like being able to manipulate cookies, all those types of things. That means someone has to rebuild the client and the application in the back end to Teams. So there has to be enough of a pull or a reason for them to invest that much time, because that's going to be a cost to them to pull developers off of whatever projects they're on to then go and fix that.
Sure. I think this question a lot of people might have, and we talked about this in pre-show banter, but Microsoft is pushing out new teams. Are these issues still present in the updated version?
Yeah, because the Teams is just what I like to call window dressing around the fact that this is all related to the backend APIs. Nothing has changed there. I've even tested, as I mentioned back in October, then this new Teams kind of was rolled out in the beginning of the year, end of last year. So that was one of the first things people asked me was, hey, does this even still work after this new push? And yes, it does, because it's all the backend stuff.
A team's activities can be monitored using SIM. If a company uses Azure Sentinel, the M365 activities can be ingested and Teams-related activities can be monitored. Who created a webhook? Who added new members in a Teams channel? Are these external domains and other Teams-related activities to monitor and create alerts on?
So I haven't found the option ability to kind of filter into those options with Teams and webhooks in Sentinel. But like, as I mentioned before, I haven't really used Sentinel a lot. So I'm sure there is a way. I don't want to say there isn't, and someone actually say, well, actually there is. I think from my testing and looking at it, investigating, it's not readily clear or easy for someone to deploy. So if we take a step back and look at organizations, if that option is very obscure and it takes 16 hours of like investigating, setting things up, not every organization is going to do that. So if it is there, Microsoft needs to make it way more readily available and easy to kind of set up and monitor.
So all right, let me get this out. We're a pen testing company that offers all kinds of services, including continuous pen testing. Like, we're gonna do pen testing thoroughly over time. Bo and Matt, question for you. Like, when you come across this kind of thing inside of your pen test engagement, like how do you write this in the report?
Like, do you mean like prior to like publicly talking about it?
Yeah, either publicly or privately.
I mean, a lot of times we kind of have like a runway of sorts of like how we actually disclose things. A lot of times we kind of use a lot of the R&D kind of deep stuff like this initially on like our continuous pen testing customers, because they kind of get the I guess like the front of all the new research, right? Like, sure. I don't know, what would you say, Matt? Like maybe a month out from using it on other customers?
Yeah, I would say a month. And if you're not familiar with what we mean by continuous testing, that's testing over a year long. So like traditional testing, you might be at a point in time of several weeks. Our continuous testing is over a whole year. So, as I mentioned, we could deploy a webhook from one attack vector and then use it down the road in another attack to kind of simulate, what an attacker would typically do if they get kicked out. They come up with a new campaign. But that 1 month span is probably what we would do.
But yeah, so in terms of like writing it up though, I mean, it's just writing up a new finding a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of creating new verbiage around what the issue is, right? And telling a customer. Yeah.
And I would also just add to that, it's having the dialogue with them, the customer, to say, hey, this is what we believe to be the fix. We are actively working with Microsoft. We're going to keep you updated. So that way they're constantly in the loop. You know, you just don't want to sound the alarm bell and just say, hey, big problem, no fix, bye. Kind of provide them, hey, we just heard back again from Microsoft. Here's the latest thing. And that also creates a great way because now there are teams involved and they can provide us some information that maybe we weren't aware of, or, you know, we didn't even view as a defensive measure.
Yeah. As a reminder to some people who may not know, we're a pen testing, red team, threat hunt, active SOC, threat hunt. Like, we do security services. In case people were like, do you make comic books and webcasts? We also do this for a living, in case you did not know. Matt, if you were to sum up everything in one final thought today, what would that be?
Teams is scary. No, I would say as more things go into the cloud applications, there needs to be more scrutiny around how they actually work and how they're secured to make sure that there are no unintended gaps or deficiencies that can be exploited. I think right now in the world, we look at protecting preventing an attacker from getting in, that hardened shell outside, GUI center inside mentality. And those types of GUI center deficiencies can often lead to recurring attacks or constantly swinging revolving door of threat actors.
Well, everybody, it has been a double header today. If you watched the first webcast and join us for the second one, thank you so much. Our interns have been furiously doing hack it in the back end. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate you being a part of this community, of us getting a chance to share our knowledge and you sharing your knowledge with each other, because that's the way that Discord works. We bring you all together, but then you all start to talk to each other. It's fantastic. There are 45,000 people on the Discord server, about 300 active at any given time, right? Because we all have lives. But if you want to jump in and start being a part of this community, we highly recommend it. Bo, thank you for being here. Brian, thank you for being here. Deb, thank you for being here. To our interns who have been furiously working behind the scenes, thank you so much for the work that you've done today. And Matt, thank you for choosing to share your knowledge with the community and not, like, our goal here is to make security better, right? Like, we want our jobs to be as hard as humanly possible when it comes time to do a pen test. We don't want it to be like an easy pen test. We want it to be hard. And the fact that you're here learning and getting this information means that you care about it too. So thank you so much. All right, everybody, that's it. It's time for me to go do a backdoors and breaches demo for a company. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Ryan,
everyone.
kill it with fire.